A man sits alone, cold and hungry on the street. His clothes are ripped. He has unattended wounds. He sits in an area of heavy traffic, hoping that someone might contribute to the funds he has collected that will cover enough for a meal that quiets the rumblings of his stomach, if only for a moment. In the hustle and bustle of life, otherwise good-intentioned men and women pass by, on their way to work, to lunch, to coffee. Some, not wanting to be inconvenienced by this reality, cross the street and quickly walk by. Others do the same. And the pattern continues over and over again. Finally, someone stops to assess the situation. This person, instead of crossing over to the other side of the street, pauses, reads of the man's struggles presented on his worn cardboard sign, and offers what he can to the man. It is not much, but it provides him with the ability to continue on, if only for one more day. The modern day Good Samaritan. In the real story, we are told that Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan to a group of leaders within the community, yet likely aware of the ways in which Jesus was bending the common thinking of the time. They wanted to know the specifics regarding eternal life. When asked what they believed to be the truth regarding this, they recite the words we know very well. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind, and not love your neighbor as yourself. But then they ask the ultimate question, but who is my neighbor? Jesus goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan who, after several others had walked by, religious folk nonetheless, helped a man who had recently been robbed, beaten, left for dead. The Good Samaritan took the man, cared for his wounds, put him up in a hotel, and took accountability for any additional needs the man might have with a loving, put it on my tab. So often we question what we know to be right and true, hoping to avoid the responsibility we have to others. It seems to me that the ones asking the questions were keenly aware there was a footnote, that when Jesus says, love your neighbor, it doesn't mean they could be loving to only those they choose to be in community with. That loving your neighbor is so much more than this. I think that in a fallen world, God knew we'd be in a tough position. Loving our neighbor is hard. Generally speaking, the people who live next to us, our literal neighbors, are probably the easiest to love. And even they can be annoying, difficult, and downright mean. In an age of keeping up with the Joneses, loving our actual neighbor is rough. And since this part, and it's supposed to be the easy part, is already so difficult, it's not surprising that we sometimes hope for permission to easily walk past the hurting, helpless, and poor. Why can we so easily be the priest and the Levite who walk past the man lying on the road? Perhaps in more relevant terms, why can we walk past the man or woman bragging on the side of the road? Why can we say that children, hungry in school and at home, are not ours to deal with? Why do we continue to actively and passively participate in racial discrimination and divide? Our comfort and contentment plagues us from stopping, crossing the road, and tending to those who are in need of our intervening on their situation, however minimally we can, with whatever gifts we've been afforded. I'd like to offer the argument that our privilege plays a large role in these issues. Our unique privilege provides us with the excuse that fits. It draws nameless and invisible boundaries that allow us to say, that's not mine to deal with. We forget that privilege such as race, ability, socioeconomic status, and even religion, the advantages and entitlements we are sometimes simply born into, other times work our way into, have plagued our country for years and continue to contribute to the divides that we still experience today. But it also places us in a position to avoid the call that we have been given, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Our privilege tells us something about how we get to get out of the situation. Our privilege lets us rationalize our lack of action. Sometimes these rationalizations are legitimate. Other times they are simply an excuse. I have to admit that I have not come up to the solution with a solution to address some of these more difficult societal issues. When preparing for our mission trip to Chicago last year, my first attempt at planning one, I was keenly aware that we would be encountering the truth of the homelessness problem in our cities. Knowing that I would have 9 youth who live in the comforts of suburbia, away from these realities, I longed for a way that we might be like the Good Samaritan and offer something instead of simply crossing the road, walking past, offering nothing when we had everything. I was aware of our privilege. We were white, upper middle class, Christian, able-bodied, heterosexual, young-ish people. We would have been actual young people, but Jason, while fiercely joining us on this trip, is old and an outlier in this area of age, and that messed this part of the sermon up. But he's also a man in a sea of women, so he made up for it in that part. Yet overall, on the list of isms, we were on the winning end of every single one. We were the ultimate representation of privilege. And we were already doing a couple projects in the city, trying to help and love our neighbor, and most importantly, actually be nice to each other, which was probably the most difficult part. I don't know if you've ever had a bunch of girls, not to mention several sets of siblings on a trip, but just being nice to each other was an accomplishment in itself. We were already doing our part. And we address homelessness in our own community. We make meals for the homeless once a month. That's enough, right? What's more, our fundraising, while successful, was not that successful. What could we possibly offer? We had every perceived excuse in the book to simply walk by. But doing that, I feared, would make us the priest and the Levite, not the Good Samaritan. Our privilege further complicates the issue that shapes the acceptable ways we can show love to our neighbor. The stigma of homelessness and drug use has plagued our society, and we associate money with finding the next fix. So naturally, simply giving money to the homeless we encountered would result in just this. Our privilege tells us because we have the money to offer support, we get to decide how our money is used, instead of offering it up, free and clear, to those who need it, allowing them to decide how they need to be served. Because I work in the field of substance abuse and dependence, I am mostly unconcerned with where my money will go. The power that substances have on an individual and the intensity of withdrawal that can occur astounds me daily. Yes, some will use your money to buy drugs, but there is a reason why. Ultimately, we have created a society where accessing services to address the issues of substance dependence is nearly impossible. Even at my own place of employment, we rarely accept those without insurance coverage and the funds to cover such costly help. And by the way, for drug and alcohol treatment, medical assistance is hardly accepted and usually limits the care that people need to a mediocre program for a period of time that cannot fully address the underlying mental health and trauma issues that almost always coincide with drug use. And the coins we toss in a cup are certainly unlikely to cover the $150 per session treatment costs. We don't want to give money to the homeless because they'll use it on drugs, but we haven't created programs that are accessible to the homeless. We don't cross the road to help the hurting, and while our privilege helps us access health care that accommodates substance abuse treatment, we fail to look beyond that privilege to see the major discrepancies in health insurance coverage across the board. But the flip side of privilege, and here's the good news, is that when people with some of it gather and willingly give some of it up, something good can happen. When people with privilege listen to the hurting and then advocate for their needs as they present them, people listen, and if we can work for good and not evil, change can actually occur. So we, in light of the stigma of passing out hard cash, created blessing bags containing non-perishable food items, toiletries, and clean socks. While we did a lot of other things during that week, I'm fairly certain these experiences were the most memorable for my youth. Reflecting on the trip, one young lady shared her emotions as a man gratefully took our bag and immediately changed into the clean socks we provided. Oh, to live in a world where clean socks are not in such great need. After such a positive experience, our kids started seeking out others to share this love with. They willingly carried relatively heavy bags and were empowered to look at the hurting instead of the hustle and bustle of the city around us. As they spoke to those they encountered in the street, they learned about inequality and privilege. They learned to cross the street. They learned to be like the Good Samaritan and help others in need of their love, grace, and understanding. I think it's important to note, too, the way in which God shows up as the Good Samaritan in our own lives. Is it not God who finds us when we are hurting, broken, left on the side of the road, and need someone to pass by, clean our wounds, and find us a comfortable place to lie? This is the good news, that even in our ugliest times, God crosses the road and shows up for us, offering grace and love. God is the ultimate Good Samaritan. So if we are committed to striving to bringing the kingdom here in this ugly, broken world, as it is in heaven, we must consider the ways in which we can stop and help. We cannot continue to pass, hoping that someone else will take charge and address the broken places in this world. In scriptures, we are called time and time again to cross over, to break the invisible lines we have created that keep us separate and steeped in our privilege. So often our differences separate us from each other. We've allowed our privilege to override our duty to help in creating a fair and just world, like we're called to do. In recent months, we've been privy to the harsh reality of the world we've assisted in creating. Passively and actively, we avoided taking a stand. We've avoided addressing the issues that have plagued us as a nation for years, yet get swept under the rug time and time again. We've avoided crossing the road. Until we are able to walk across the road and help the hurting man, we have not fulfilled the call to love our neighbor. I was asked to tell you a story, but now I'd like to ask you to reconsider writing our story. Not the biblical one, that one's still good. The story we need to rewrite is our own. We must recreate the narratives we have created in this world. The one that, for example, tells us that poor people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or whatever small whispers we have heard for years and have so drastically informed us of our stance. Aware that in order to combat privilege, we must sacrifice something of our own. We each have an area of our life where this can apply. It does not only apply to the area of homelessness. Without diversity in our own hearts and what we are called to challenge and change in our own lives and in the world, we wouldn't be able to do as much as we do. The wonderful thing about stories is that while the ones in books are over in a few pages, the ones we are creating as the body of Christ continue generation after generation. It is time for us to stop and consider how we would write the story, which is the story that we hope it to take to the generation that follows. Jesus asks them at the end of his storytelling, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? The one who had mercy on him, they replied. Jesus told them, "Go and do likewise. And so I say to you, beloved, go and do likewise."